The mechanic had always loved machines more than people. There was something honest about the way gears fit together, the way engines hummed when they worked perfectly, the way a spark or a screw could make all the difference. He had spent most of his life in remote outposts, far from bustling cities, fixing broken ships, damaged engines, and malfunctioning tools. Life was simple, predictable, and safe until that day dot. It started like any other day. The mechanic walked along the jagged, metal streets of a dilapidated scrapyard on the edge of the desert planet. Rusted hulls of alien ships jutted out like broken teeth, and the wind carried the scent of oil, scorched metal, and something else he couldn't quite place. It was faint, but it lingered in the corners of his nose, like a warning he didn't understand yet. He was hunting for a replacement gear for a small hovercraft that had been left behind by a trader. As he ducked under a fallen beam, his eyes caught movement. At first, he thought it was a trick of the shadows, a ripple of dust, or the glint of metal. But then he saw a dot. It was a feline predator. Not like any cat he had seen on Earth or anywhere else, but an alien species with sleek, rippling muscles, long claws, and piercing eyes that seemed to glow even in the dim light. Its fur was dark and shiny, streaked with stripes that shimmered in colors he couldn't name. But what struck him more than its appearance was the chains. Thick, metal chains held the creature tightly against a wall of jagged metal. There were scars all over its body, and it looked as if it had not moved freely in years. The mechanic froze. He had seen wild creatures before, dangerous ones that could rip through metal or even humans in seconds. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just a wild animal. It was a prisoner. Its golden eyes followed him cautiously, full of pain and exhaustion. And yet there was a spark of intelligence there, as if it understood everything happening around it. Workers in the scrapyard noticed him staring. They shouted warnings. "Stay away from that thing," one of them yelled. "It's dangerous. You don't know what it can do." But the mechanic didn't move. He felt a tug in his chest, a feeling that told him this creature did not belong in chains. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he had to do something. The workers jeered and waved their tools, but he stepped closer. He could hear the creature's labored breathing, the rattle of its chains as it shifted. Its claws scraped against the metal floor weakly. The mechanic took a deep breath and made his decision. He would help it, no matter the risk. He approached slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. He spoke softly, almost whispering, as if trying to reach the creature with words it could understand. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." The chains rattled again, but there was no attack. The predator's ears flicked, and its gaze held his steadily. He could feel the tension in the air, the silent question hanging between them. Can I trust him? He knelt down and examined the chains. They were heavy and old, rusted in places but still strong. They had been designed not only to hold the creature, but also to prevent it from using its strength. The mechanic's hands moved quickly, pulling out tools from his belt pliers, a small torch, and a set of wrenches. Every sound of metal on metal made the predator flinch, but he spoke to it the entire time, soft and calm, as if trying to soothe an injured child. Hours seemed to pass. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows over the scrapyard. Workers had mostly left by then, unwilling to wait and watch what might happen. The mechanic worked tirelessly, sweat dripping down his forehead, arms aching, hands scratched and bruised from the sharp edges. But he didn't stop. Every movement had to be precise. One wrong cut, one slip of the tool, and the chains could snap back, or the predator could lash out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last restraint fell away with a heavy clang. The predator's eyes widened slightly, and it slowly pushed itself up on trembling legs. For a moment, it didn't move. It just looked at him. There was caution, yes, but also something else, recognition, perhaps, that he had done what no one else dared. The mechanic exhaled and stepped back. He didn't reach out to touch it. Not yet. He knew better than to force trust. He had freed it, but the creature had to decide its next move. For minutes that felt like hours, they simply stared at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. The predator was free, but its body was weak, its spirit battered. It didn't run. It didn't strike. It just stayed, eyes fixed on him, waiting. The wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint metallic smell of the scrapyard. He noticed the predator's breathing was shallow, uneven. Clearly, it had not eaten in a long time. Its muscles twitched as if aching from years of confinement. The mechanic knew he couldn't leave it here. He couldn't just walk away and pretend this didn't happen. He had freed it, and now he had a responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. With careful movements, he reached for a large crate nearby, using it as a makeshift stretcher. He spoke softly again, coaxing the predator to move. Slowly, it allowed him to lift it, surprisingly light in his arms despite its size. Every muscle was tense, every claw poised, but it didn't resist. Perhaps it sensed he meant no harm. Perhaps it was too exhausted to do anything else. Carrying the creature across the scrapyard was harder than anything he had done before. The sun was beginning to set, and shadows stretched across the jagged metal terrain. Every step was careful, every movement measured. He felt the eyes of the few remaining workers on him, some curious, some fearful. He ignored them. His focus was entirely on the creature in his arms. Finally, he reached his small workshop on the edge of the outpost. It was a humble place, filled with tools, spare parts, and a comforting smell of oil and metal. He lowered the predator gently onto the floor. It lay there, breathing heavily, eyes half closed, but still alive. The mechanic took a moment to catch his own breath, heart pounding from the exertion and the adrenaline. He looked down at the creature, studying its face. There was a nobility in it, a wild intelligence that no chains could ever completely suppress. He didn't know what it had endured, what kind of life it had been forced to live, or why anyone would enslave such a magnificent being. All he knew was that he had done the right thing. He had freed it. The night fell outside, stars glimmering faintly over the desert planet. The mechanic sat quietly on the floor, watching the predator rest. It was still wary, muscles twitching occasionally, but there was no aggression. He could see the spark of life returning in its eyes. For the first time, the creature was breathing freely, unbound, safe for now. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the scrapyard workers would return, if someone would come to claim the creature, or if it would suddenly turn on him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A connection to another living being, fragile yet undeniable. That night, the mechanic didn't sleep. He sat by the creature, tending to its wounds, cleaning its fur, offering scraps of food. He spoke to it, telling it stories about machines, about his life, about why he couldn't just leave it chained. He didn't expect it to understand words, but perhaps it understood the tone, the intent, the kindness behind them. By the time dawn approached, the predator lifted its head slightly, eyes meeting his with what seemed almost like gratitude. Mechanic smiled faintly, feeling a bond forming between them. He didn't yet know the challenges ahead, the dangers that would follow, or the responsibilities that would now fall on him. But one thing was clear. The choice to free the creature had changed everything. His life, once predictable and safe, was about to become something extraordinary. And somewhere in the shadows, beyond the edge of the scrapyard, eyes watched them. Both. Eyes that belonged not to ordinary creatures, but to beings of power and authority, beings who would soon notice that the feline predator had been freed, and that the human mechanic who dared to do it might be about to face consequences he could never have imagined. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the dusty workshop in pale gold. The mechanic had spent the night on the floor, close to the feline predator. He hadn't slept much. Every small sound made him tense. A clatter outside, the whir of a distant hovercraft, even the soft sigh of the wind against the metal walls made him glance up, expecting trouble. But the predator lay quietly, its breathing more even, though every so often it twitched, restless from long years of confinement. He moved slowly, careful not to startle it. He could feel the heat of its body, even through the sparse blanket he had thrown over it. Its fur was still matted in some places, and deep scratches and scars ran along its sides, evidence of a cruel life in chains. The mechanic sighed, feeling a pang of guilt mixed with determination. He had freed it, yes, but freeing it was only the first step. The predator needed care, food, and trust, things he had no experience with. He went to the small storage area in the corner of his workshop and retrieved what he could find: dried meat, some fresh water, and a handful of medical supplies left from his own emergency kit. The predator lifted its head when he returned, eyes alert and fixed on him, watching every movement. He knelt down slowly and placed the food a few steps away, letting it decide to approach on its own. For long moments, it didn't move. The mechanic stayed perfectly still, heart thumping in his chest. He didn't want to scare it. Then, with a slow, cautious step, the predator crept toward the food. Its nose twitched as it sniffed, and then it ate. It was careful at first, taking small bites, always glancing at him. The mechanic exhaled quietly, relief washing over him. At least it trusted him enough to eat. He cleaned some of its wounds with gentle hands, carefully applying salves to prevent infection. It growled softly, not in anger but in discomfort, and he flinched at the sound, though he didn't pull back. He spoke in a low, calm voice, telling it everything would be okay. "I know it hurts," he said. "I know they hurt you, but it's going to get better now. I'll make sure of it." Days passed, and the predator began to regain strength. Its movements were slow at first, tentative, but each day it stretched further, tested its claws, and even began to stand taller, eyes brighter. The mechanic spent hours by its side, teaching it, in a way, how to feel safe again. He talked to it while fixing machines, explaining the way engines worked, why parts fit together, why balance and patience mattered. Sometimes the predator would watch him quietly, tilting its head, as if it understood more than any human should expect. Despite the progress, the mechanic could feel the danger lurking around him. He knew that the creature didn't belong to him. Records from old data chips he had found in the scrapyard hinted that these predators were considered property by the alien authorities, known as the War Guardians. They were elite protectors, feared across planets, and any tampering with their property was strictly forbidden. He didn't know what would happen if they discovered he had freed the predator, but he also couldn't bring himself to return it. To chains, visitors to the outpost were wary. Some avoided him entirely. Others whispered behind his back. They said the predator was dangerous, that it could turn on him at any moment, that he had no right to interfere with creatures that were not meant to be free. He ignored the warnings. He had always believed that a creature's will mattered, that freedom was more important than fear. He had seen what cruelty could do, and he couldn't stand by when he had the power to help. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in red and orange, the mechanic noticed a change in the predator. It no longer flinched at every sound. Its eyes, once cautious and wary, now held something new, a calm intelligence, a trust that grew each day. It followed him around the workshop, not closely like a pet, but respectfully, as if acknowledging that he was the one who had given it life again. The mechanic smiled faintly, feeling a bond forming that went beyond words. He started exploring ways to keep the predator fed and safe. He reinforced the workshop doors and created hidden spaces for it to rest, places where it could feel secure without feeling trapped. He experimented with different foods, observing its reactions, learning its preferences, and gaining insight into its behavior. Sometimes it would play with small tools, adding them across the floor with delicate precision. Other times it would sit silently, watching him as if judging his every move, evaluating whether he was worthy of its trust. Despite the quiet moments, tension always lingered. The mechanic couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from the edges of the outpost. Sometimes, shadows seemed to move where no one should be. Other times, a gust of wind carried a sound like metal scraping across stone or the faint hum of distant engines, and he would freeze, expecting confrontation. But no one came, at least, not yet. The predator's recovery became almost a routine. Each morning, it would wait near the doorway, stretching its legs and yawning in the sunlight. It began exploring the workshop more freely, testing corners, climbing on high shelves, and watching the mechanic with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. The mechanic laughed quietly at its antics, marveling at the strength and grace of the creature, the way it moved with fluid precision, as if every muscle remembered what freedom felt like, even after years of chains. One day, while he was repairing a broken hover engine, the predator approached him quietly. It nudged his hand with its head, a gentle, deliberate touch. The mechanic froze, unsure how to interpret it. Was it gratitude, trust, or a warning? He smiled and patted its head softly. For the first time, he felt a sense of partnership forming. It was not just a creature he had saved. It was becoming a companion, a presence that he could rely on, just as it could rely on him. But he could not ignore the warnings any longer. The information he had gathered about the war guardians weighed heavily on his mind. They were strict, ruthless, and feared. Any human who interfered with their property could face severe consequences. He wondered if he had done the right thing, or if his compassion had led him into danger he could not escape. Even as he pondered this, the predator sensed his unease. It came close and brushed against his arm, almost as if to reassure him that he had nothing to fear from it. The gesture was simple, yet profound. The mechanic realized then that the predator had chosen to trust him completely, not out of obligation, but because of the bond they had formed through courage, patience, and care. Late that night, the mechanic sat by a small fire outside the workshop, watching the predator rest nearby. He thought about what had brought him here, about the small choices that had led him to this moment. He had followed instinct, compassion, and a sense of justice. He had acted without concern for himself, and somehow it had created a bond stronger than any chain could ever forge. He knew the war guardians would come eventually. He had no illusions about that, but he also knew that he could not betray the trust of the creature he had saved. The predator had been enslaved for too long, suffered too much, and now, finally, it was free. And as he watched it breathe peacefully in the glow of the firelight, he realized that sometimes courage was not about fighting battles with weapons, but about standing up for what was right, even when the consequences were unknown. The wind whispered through the desert, carrying the faint sound of distant engines. Somewhere, beyond the horizon, the war guardians were moving closer, drawn by the absence of chains, by the breaking of a rule that had existed for centuries. The mechanic felt a shiver of anticipation, but he didn't panic. Whatever came, he knew he would face it with the predator at his side, not as a servant or a tool, but as a companion and friend by dawn. The predator was moving with even more confidence. Its fur shone under the early light, and its eyes sparkled with awareness. The mechanic could see the change clearly. It was no longer just a rescued creature. It was alive, alert, and aware, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. And the mechanic understood in that quiet, golden morning that freeing the predator had not only changed its life, it had changed his life as well. He had no idea what the next days would bring. He had no clue about the trials that awaited him or the dangers he could not yet see. But one thing was certain. He had acted from the heart, and in doing so, he had forged a connection that no one, not even the most powerful alien authority, could easily break. The days that followed felt almost like a dream. The mechanic had fallen into a quiet rhythm, one that involved fixing broken machines by day and tending to the feline predator by night. He had never imagined his life would include caring for a creature so powerful, so intelligent, and yet so gentle once it had found safety. There was a strange balance in the way they moved around the workshop together. The predator had not yet learned to trust fully, but it was no longer tense or defensive. Its steps were measured, almost careful, as if testing a new world it had never been allowed to explore. Each morning, the mechanic would bring out food and water, placing them in the same quiet spot on the floor. The predator would approach slowly, head low, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the offerings. Sometimes it would pause, glance up at him, and then continue eating. The mechanic learned quickly that patience was more important than force. Any sudden movement, any loud sound could send it scurrying or worse, triggering defensive claws. But as days passed, he began to notice something remarkable. The creature was learning to wait, learning to trust him, even without being told. He spent hours cleaning its wounds, massaging tense muscles, and applying healing ointments. It did not resist him now. In fact, sometimes it would lean into his hands, pressing its body gently against him, as if asking for care. The mechanic marveled at this, wondering how such a proud and fearsome creature could display such vulnerability. It was a trust he had earned, and it was fragile. He could feel the tension in its muscles, the weight of its past suffering, and he knew that every act of care mattered. The predator also began to observe him. He noticed the way it would watch him for long periods while he worked on engines, its golden eyes following each movement. It would crouch silently on shelves, perched like a shadow, almost like a guardian of its own, keeping watch. At first, he had felt nervous under its scrutiny, but over time he began to see it differently. Its attention was not threatening. It was curious, analytical, and intelligent. It seemed to study him as much as he studied it, evaluating whether he was trustworthy, capable, and consistent. He found small ways to communicate with it, too. Simple gestures, soft words, gentle touches on the fur. He spoke to it as he worked, explaining what he was doing, describing how parts fit together, or why certain repairs were necessary. He didn't know if it understood the words, but he noticed. It would tilt its head at certain sounds, or shift closer when he spoke in a calmer tone. The mechanic realized that the predator wasn't just learning to survive again. It was learning to understand him, to feel him, and in turn, he was learning to understand it. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across the desert. Winds howled, sending clouds of dust and sand into the outpost. The mechanic quickly secured tools and closed the workshop doors, but the predator reacted before he could even notice. It stood alert, tail bristled, ears twitching as the wind screamed through cracks in the walls. Its body was tense, ready to spring, but it didn't run. Instead, it stayed close to him, its golden eyes scanning the horizon. The mechanic placed a hand on its side, feeling the muscles ripple under his fingers. "It's okay," he murmured. "We're safe here." No one can touch us. For the first time, he saw its eyes soften, a slight easing of tension, as if it trusted him to protect it from the storm. That moment, brief and simple, felt like a bond that could not be broken. He realized then that trust was not given, it was earned slowly, with patience, kindness, and consistency. As the predator regained strength, it began exploring more boldly. It would leap across workbenches with grace, test its claws on soft pieces of scrap metal, and sometimes sit silently near the open doorway, watching the horizon as though it remembered a world beyond captivity. The mechanic was fascinated by the way it moved, every muscle in harmony, every motion controlled yet fluid. He often paused in his work just to observe it, marveling at its combination of raw power and elegance. Sometimes, in quiet moments, he would speak to it about his own life, the solitude he had always lived with, and the choices that had led him to this remote outpost. The predator would sit nearby, listening in silence. It was not a response he expected, but the act of listening felt meaningful. There was a connection forming beyond words, beyond gestures, a quiet understanding between two beings who had survived different kinds of hardship, but the mechanic knew danger was never far away. He had heard stories from other workers in the outpost about war guardians, the elite alien protectors who claimed ownership of creatures like the one he had freed. They were feared for their strength, intelligence, and ruthlessness. Anyone who interfered with their property could face serious consequences, sometimes even death. The mechanic felt a pang of worry every time he thought about it. Yet he could not return the predator to chains. The thought of doing so was unbearable. He began preparing for the possibility that the guardians might come for the creature. He reinforced the workshop, created hidden nooks for the predator to hide, and learned to move silently when necessary. He did not expect to fool them, but he hoped to buy time, to protect the creature until he could understand more about what he had gotten himself into. The predator seemed to sense the tension in his mind, and it would stay close, brushing against his side as if offering silent reassurance. The bond between them deepened with each passing day. The predator began to respond to small cues, a gesture of a hand, the tone of a voice. It would follow him when he moved between workstations, sit beside him during long hours of repair, and occasionally nuzzle his arm in a gesture of trust. The mechanic found himself smiling more than he had in years. Feeling the presence of another living being is both comforting and inspiring. One evening, he noticed something unusual. The predator, normally quiet and reserved at night, was restless. It paced in short bursts, ears twitching toward the horizon. The mechanic followed its gaze, but there was nothing visible, just the desert stretching endlessly under the starlight. He placed a hand on its shoulder and whispered, "It's okay. Nothing's coming tonight." The predator paused, eyes meeting his, and slowly relaxed. The mechanic realized that it was not just the desert it feared, it was a world that had been cruel to it before. His presence was slowly teaching it that not all beings intended harm. The mechanic also started to learn more about the predator's habits, preferences, and limits. He noticed what foods it liked, which movements calmed it, and how it reacted to sudden sounds. Every day was a lesson in patience and observation. He could see the creature's confidence returning, its posture becoming stronger, its gaze sharper. The scars on its body remained, but the glow in its eyes grew brighter, as if reclaiming the spark of life that had been buried under years of suffering. He realized that the predator was more than just an animal. It was intelligent, capable of reasoning, and capable of choosing. That understanding both thrilled and terrified him. He had freed it, but that freedom came with responsibility. He could guide it, care for it, and protect it, but he could not control it. And yet, the trust it placed in him was something he had never experienced with another human. By the end of the week, The mechanic began to notice subtle gestures of companionship. The predator would rest its head on his knee while he worked, or brush its tail against his leg when he spoke softly. It was a silent, mutual understanding. He would care for it, and it would respect him in return. He had never felt such a profound connection in his life, a connection that was built not on words or commands, but on actions, patience, and shared survival. And still, there was an underlying tension. The mechanic could not ignore the fact that they were outsiders, that the war guardians would not overlook the disappearance of one of their elite creatures. The thought of their arrival lingered at the back of his mind, creating a constant mix of anticipation and worry. He prepared for confrontation in small ways, hiding tools, securing exits, and teaching the predator to respond to quiet signals. He didn't know if it would be enough, but it was all he could do. As night fell again, he sat beside the predator, watching it stretch and yawn, muscles rippling in the dim firelight. He felt a deep sense of purpose he had never known before. This creature was no longer just an animal, and he was no longer just a mechanic. They had become companions, allies in a small corner of the universe, bound by trust and courage. Whatever came next, danger, confrontation, or adventure, they would face it together. And somewhere far beyond the workshop, unseen and patient, the first signs of attention were beginning to stir. The war guardians, elite and unyielding, were moving closer, drawn by the absence of chains and the bold act of freedom. The mechanic did not know it yet, but the world he thought he knew was about to change forever. The quiet of the outpost was shattered one morning by a low rumble that vibrated through the desert. The mechanic, who had grown accustomed to the hum of machinery and the occasional distant hovercraft, froze. The sound was different, deep, controlled, and heavy. Dust swirled across the workshop as the ground beneath him trembled slightly. The feline predator lifted its head immediately, ears pricked, eyes scanning the horizon with sharp focus. Its body tensed, muscles coiled like springs ready for action. The mechanic's heart raced. He had suspected that someone would come eventually. He had always known that freeing a creature belonging to the war guardians was risky. But the reality of it arriving, so sudden and undeniable, made him momentarily doubt his courage. He moved closer to the predator, speaking in a calm, low voice. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Through the shimmering heat of the desert, silhouettes appeared, large, armored forms descending slowly from hovering ships. Their landing was precise, silent except for the faint hiss of energy shields and the hum of advanced engines. The mechanic had never seen anything like them. They were tall, imposing, and their armor reflected the desert sunlight in sharp, blinding angles. Even from a distance, their presence radiated authority, strength, and control. The predator shifted, growling softly. The mechanic could feel the tension in its body, the coiled energy beneath the fur. It had faced captivity and cruelty before, but these beings were different. These were not scavengers or ordinary aliens. They were the war guardians themselves, the very enforcers of power he had feared. And now they had come to reclaim what he had freed. The guardians stopped a few meters from the workshop, their leader stepping forward. Unlike the others, this one moved with a calm, deliberate authority. The others stood behind, silent and unmoving, as if waiting for a signal. The mechanic realized that any wrong move now could be catastrophic. He could feel the weight of every second, every glance, every breath. One of the guardians raised a hand, and the hum of their energy shields intensified slightly. They spoke in a language the mechanic did not understand, a series of low, resonant tones that carried an unmistakable command. The predator reacted immediately, crouching slightly, muscles taut, but it did not flee. It stood by his side as if silently declaring its loyalty. The mechanic took a cautious step forward, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. I didn't know," he said softly, hoping they could understand some gesture of explanation. "I found it chained. It was suffering. I couldn't leave it there." He glanced at the predator, noticing the way it held its ground, eyes sharp and alert, but not aggressive toward the guardians. It was a stance he had never seen before, a mix of respect, trust, and readiness. The lead guardian tilted its head slightly, studying the scene with careful attention. The predator's reaction was unusual. Normally, these creatures would obey the guardians without question, either fleeing or preparing to fight. But this one stood firm, its gaze locked on the mechanic, as if silently declaring, "This is my choice." The mechanic's pulse quickened. He had no idea if the guardians could sense this choice, or if they would simply enforce their authority by force. He felt a mixture of fear and hope. He had acted out of compassion, without thought for himself, but now the stakes were higher than he could have imagined. The predator stepped slightly forward, placing itself between the mechanic and the guardians. It was a deliberate, measured motion, powerful yet controlled. Its eyes locked on the lead guardian, and the growl that rumbled from its throat was low, warning but not threatening. The mechanic realized then that the creature was no longer just reacting, it was assessing, making a choice. The lead guardian moved closer, circling the predator slowly, observing its stance, the tension in its muscles, the intensity of its gaze. The others remained behind, silent and imposing, like statues carved from metal and light. The air was thick with anticipation, each second stretching as the mechanic held his breath, unsure what would happen next. To his astonishment, the lead guardian stopped and raised a hand again, this time in a gesture of acknowledgement rather than command. The predator responded immediately, lowering its body slightly, but keeping its eyes on the guardian. It was a subtle, nuanced communication, a silent understanding passing between them that the mechanic could barely comprehend. The mechanic stepped back slightly, amazed at what he was witnessing. The predator was no longer a prisoner. It was engaging in a ritual, a test of authority and choice. And remarkably, it seemed to have chosen him, the human who had freed it, over the very beings that had once enslaved it. The guardian's gaze shifted to him. For a long moment, it studied him with an intensity that made the mechanic's stomach tighten. He held the gaze, trying to show nothing but honesty and calm. He spoke softly, repeating the truth in a language the guardian might somehow sense. "I only wanted to help. I didn't mean harm." The predator nudged him gently with its head, a quiet reassurance. It was as if it were saying, "I trust him. You will see." The guardian seemed to sense the connection. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in its stance eased. The other guardians remained motionless, watching, but even they seemed to acknowledge something unusual. This was not a normal interaction. This creature had chosen, and somehow they recognized it. The mechanic's mind raced. Could the guardian actually honor the choice of the predator? Would it understand loyalty born not from fear, but from trust and care? He did not know, but he could feel a shift in the air, a subtle change in the dynamics of power. The predator was no longer a tool, no longer a slave. It was a being with agency, and it had placed its faith in him. Hours seemed to pass in seconds. The desert sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on the tense scene, but neither side moved aggressively. The predator sat calmly now, head held high, eyes still sharp, tail flicking lightly. The mechanic knelt slightly, keeping himself grounded, showing no threat. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, to hide, to surrender, but he did not. He could not abandon the creature, not now. Then something remarkable happened. The lead guardian extended its hand toward the predator, not in command, but in what the mechanic instinctively understood as a gesture of acknowledgement. The predator leaned forward slightly, touching the guardian's hand with its nose, a subtle, measured act that carried centuries of ritual and meaning. It was a signal that the guardian understood, a recognition that the bond between human and predator was legitimate, and that the creature had chosen its companion. The mechanic exhaled, relief washing over him in a wave. The tension did not vanish, but it shifted. The guardians were no longer just enforcers. They were witnesses. They had observed the choice, the loyalty, and the courage it took for a human to free and care for a being so powerful. Slowly, the lead guardian lowered its hand and stepped back, signaling to the others. The hum of their energy shields faded slightly, a small acknowledgement that this encounter would not end in violence. The predator padded forward, brushing against the mechanic's legs, a silent affirmation of trust. The mechanic knelt to meet it at eye level, feeling the warmth of its body and the strength that lay beneath the surface. He could see the respect in its eyes, and he felt it radiate outward, touching even the guardians who watched silently. Desert was quiet again, except for the faint hiss of wind and the distant hum of engines. The guardians lingered for a moment, then slowly lifted off in their ships, leaving only the memory of their presence behind. The mechanic and the predator remained in the workshop, side by side, both breathing heavily from the tension, both aware that this encounter had changed everything. For the first time, the mechanic understood something profound. Courage and compassion could earn respect even from the most powerful. And the predator, once a prisoner, now stood beside him as a companion and ally, unbound not just in body, but in spirit. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together, not as master and servant, but as partners bound by trust, loyalty, and the shared experience of survival. As night fell over the outpost, the mechanic sat outside the workshop with the predator at his side. The stars twinkled above, the desert stretching endlessly around them. He knew that the guardians were still out there, watching, waiting, and judging, but he no longer felt fear. He had acted with honesty, with courage, and with care. And now, the predator had chosen him in a way that even the most elite warriors of the universe could recognize. For the first time, he felt a sense of belonging, not just in the world of humans or machines, but in a larger universe where trust, loyalty, and courage could transcend chains, species, and authority. The predator curled at his side, a silent guardian, while he watched the night sky, knowing that the real journey was only just beginning. The desert morning was quiet, almost eerily so. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the workshop, painting everything in soft gold. The mechanic had barely slept, his mind still buzzing with thoughts from the previous day. He had seen the war guardians, the armored enforcers of the universe, approach and leave, and he knew that their eyes were still on him. But for the first time, he felt a mixture of hope and anticipation. Today felt different. The predator was awake, early, pacing slowly near the open doorway of the workshop. Its muscles moved with the grace of a creature fully in control of its body, and its eyes shone with intelligence, alert and aware. The mechanic watched it quietly, fascinated by the subtle changes in posture, the way it carried itself. It was no longer a frightened prisoner. It was confident, powerful, and aware that the world beyond the workshop held danger, but it also held choice. The lead guardian returned that morning, not alone this time. A small group of guardians accompanied them, their presence heavy, commanding. They landed a short distance from the workshop, their ships humming softly as they descended. Dust swirled in their wake, and the mechanic could feel the vibration. Through the ground, the predator's ears flicked, its gaze fixed on the approaching figures. It crouched slightly, but there was no fear in its eyes, only attention. The guardian leader stepped forward first, eyes scanning the mechanic and the predator. There was no aggression, but there was authority. A silent message that the time had come for the ritual of choice. The mechanic swallowed hard. He had read about this ritual in old data files, but he had never imagined he would witness it firsthand. In their culture, creatures like the predator did not simply bond with humans. They were bound by law to serve. The war guardians unless they chose otherwise, and that choice was rare, almost unheard of for a human. The mechanic took a deep breath, standing as still as he could. His hands were empty, his body relaxed but ready. The predator stepped closer to him, brushing lightly against his legs. It was a gesture that carried meaning. It was reassurance, a silent communication that whatever came, it had made its decision. The mechanic's chest tightened, a mixture of fear and awe. He had saved this creature's life, and now it was choosing him, not out of obligation, but out of trust and respect. The lead guardian raised a hand in a signal, and the predator responded immediately. Its body tensed and then relaxed, every movement precise and deliberate. The other guardians watched silently, their energy shields humming faintly, as if holding their collective breath. The ritual had begun. The predator stepped forward, circling the mechanic slowly, head held high, tail moving in deliberate arcs. Its eyes never left him, studying him with an intensity that felt almost human. The mechanic knelt slightly, lowering himself to meet its gaze, showing that he posed no threat. He spoke softly, almost a whisper. "I won't let anyone hurt you. I'll protect you, always." The predator paused for a moment, tilting its head as if acknowledging the promise. The lead guardian moved closer, extending a hand toward the predator. This was the customary gesture, an invitation for the creature to reaffirm its loyalty to the guardians or to make a new choice. The predator approached slowly, moving with caution but purpose. It paused directly in front of the mechanic, eyes locking with his. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold still. The desert wind softened, the dust paused in the air, and even the guardians seemed frozen in time. Then, in a single deliberate motion, the predator touched its nose to the mechanic's chest. The contact was light, gentle, yet powerful in its significance. It was a declaration. It had chosen him. The guardians stepped back, exchanging glances. Some of them lowered their weapons slightly, as if recognizing the depth of the bond that had been formed. This was no ordinary selection. The predator had defied expectation, placing trust in a human where centuries of tradition dictated otherwise. The mechanic's heart pounded. He reached out slowly, placing a hand over the predator's head, feeling the heat and strength beneath. "The fur. We'll face this together," he whispered, voice trembling slightly with emotion. The predator leaned into the touch, a quiet affirmation that the choice was mutual. They were partners now, bonded not by law or obligation, but by trust, courage, and respect. The guardians observed the ritual closely, their faces unreadable behind their helmets. The lead guardian stepped forward again, touching the predator lightly with a ceremonial device, acknowledging the bond. The creature responded without hesitation, reaffirming its choice of the mechanic. The other guardians stepped back, giving space, as if understanding that this bond could not be broken by force or authority. The mechanic could hardly believe what had just happened. He had acted out of instinct, compassion, and courage. He had freed the predator from chains, nursed it back to health, and treated it with respect. And now it had chosen him as its companion, a recognition that even the most powerful enforcers of the universe had to respect. He felt a surge of pride and humility all at once. The predator padded to his side, brushing its body against his legs in a gesture of loyalty. It was powerful, graceful, and alive, a stark contrast to the weak, chained creature he had found days ago. He knelt to meet its gaze, feeling a wave of emotion he had never known before. This was more than survival. It was partnership, respect, and shared destiny. The lead guardians spoke again, in their resonant language, a series of tones the mechanic could not understand. But the meaning was clear. They acknowledged the bond. They would not take the predator by force. They would allow the choice to stand. It was a rare gesture, one that even seasoned guardians did not often witness. The mechanic realized that he had done more than save a life. He had earned the respect of a species that demanded obedience and courage. The other guardians slowly lifted off, their ships ascending into the sky. The hum of engines faded, leaving the desert quiet once more. The mechanic and the predator stood together in the warm light of the rising sun, the bond between them now undeniable and official. They had survived the ritual, faced authority, and emerged stronger together. The mechanic reached down, stroking the predator's fur, feeling the warmth and strength beneath his fingers. "You chose me," he said softly. "I won't let you down. I promise." The predator responded with a quiet, almost imperceptible nuzzle against his hand, a simple but powerful affirmation. It was a promise in return, unspoken yet understood. It would follow him, trust him, and stand by his side, whatever the future might hold. As the day progressed, the mechanic began to prepare for the next phase of their journey. The predator moved beside him, attentive and calm, learning his routines, observing the world with renewed curiosity. The bond between them was no longer tentative. It was established, deep, and mutual. He realized that he had gained not just a companion, but a protector, a friend, and a witness to his own courage. That night, as stars sparkled above the desert, the mechanic sat outside the workshop, the predator curled at his side. The wind whispered across the sands, carrying the faint echo of distant engines, a reminder that the guardians were still out there, observing, waiting, judging. But he no longer felt fear. He had acted with honesty, bravery, and care, and the choice had been recognized. He had saved a life, and in doing so, had changed his own forever. The predator's breathing was steady, its body relaxed against his. The mechanic could feel the trust and loyalty radiating from it, a living bond that no one could sever. In that quiet desert night, he realized something profound. True courage was not in fighting alone, but in standing up for what was right, even when the outcome was uncertain. And trust, once earned, could bridge the gap between species, worlds, and authority itself. For the first time in his life, the mechanic felt complete. He had a purpose beyond machines, beyond routine, beyond isolation. He had a companion who had chosen him freely, a living testament to courage, patience, and care. And together, they would face whatever the universe could throw at them, bonded not by chains, but by respect, loyalty, and a shared journey that was only just beginning. The desert stretched endlessly around them, silent and vast, a world of both beauty and danger. But for now, the mechanic and the predator sat together, side by side, watching the stars, knowing that their bond had survived the ultimate test. They were partners, equals, and chosen by fate and courage alike. And as dawn approached, the mechanic knew with certainty that life would never be the same again. The desert morning was calm, almost peaceful, but the mechanic knew better than to trust appearances. After the events with the war guardians, he understood that the universe was vast, unpredictable, and full of beings with power far beyond his own. Yet, as he looked at the predator curled at his side, he felt something he had never felt before: confidence, not in himself alone, but in their partnership. Together, they could face whatever came. The predator had fully recovered now. Its scars remained, but they were marks of survival, not weakness. Its fur shone under the sunlight, and its eyes glimmered with awareness, intelligence, and trust. The mechanic had spent countless hours observing it, learning its habits, and adapting his own routines to accommodate its needs. He had realized that care was not just about feeding or healing. It was about understanding, respecting, and building a relationship. And that relationship had grown into something extraordinary. Every morning began with routines that had become second nature. The predator would stretch near the workshop, moving with grace and power, and the mechanic would prepare food while watching it carefully. They had developed a silent language over time gestures, glances, even subtle movements of the tail or ears could convey meaning. It was a bond built on trust, patience, and mutual respect, one that neither words nor authority could break. The mechanic decided to explore beyond the outpost. He knew the desert held dangerous hostile creatures, sudden sandstorms, and the lingering presence of the guardians, but he also knew it held opportunity. They had survived the guardians' first visit, and the predator's choice had been acknowledged. Now they could reclaim a part of the world that had once been denied to them both. As they moved across the dunes, the predator stayed close, always alert, occasionally scanning their horizon with sharp eyes. It was both protector and guide, leading the mechanic around unstable terrain, warning him of hidden pitfalls, and occasionally nudging him forward when he hesitated. The mechanic marveled at the subtlety of its actions. This was more than instinct. It was intelligence, awareness, and partnership in its purest form. Over time, the mechanic began to notice small changes in himself. He had always been practical, cautious, and solitary, but the predator's presence had shifted something within him. He thought more carefully about every choice, every action, not just for himself, but for them both. He had learned patience, empathy, and courage in ways that no human mentor could have taught. And he felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the life he had saved was now giving back in its own way. Through trust, loyalty, and companionship, they encountered other desert travelers along the way. Some stared in awe at the predator, unsure whether to fear it or admire it. Others whispered to one another, noting the unusual pairing of human and creature. The mechanic ignored them mostly, focusing on their path, their shared survival. But he couldn't deny that the presence of the predator had changed the perception of those around him. Where once he might have been seen as vulnerable or ordinary, now he moved with quiet authority, backed by the loyalty and strength of a being the universe itself feared and respected. One afternoon, while resting near a rocky outcrop, the predator suddenly stood alert, ears flicking, muscles tense. The mechanic followed its gaze and saw a group of hostile scavengers approaching from a distance. Their movements were aggressive, weapons crude but dangerous. The predator growled low, a warning, and the mechanic felt a surge of adrenaline. He had learned to trust its instincts implicitly. The predator moved forward, placing itself between the mechanic and the scavengers, its body tense, ready to strike if necessary. But it did not act without reason. It waited, calculating, observing. The mechanic stayed behind, following its cues, prepared to defend himself, but aware that the predator had control over the situation. In moments, the scavengers paused, sensing the power and authority of the predator. Their confidence faltered, and without a sound, they retreated, leaving the mechanic and the predator unscathed. The mechanic exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and awe washing over him. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he whispered, placing a hand gently on the predator's head. The creature responded with a nuzzle, a quiet affirmation of trust and loyalty. It was a moment of connection, simple yet profound, reminding him why he had risked everything to save it. As days passed, their bond deepened further. The mechanic learned to anticipate the predator's movements, to communicate through gestures and subtle sounds. In return, the predator began to respond to his moods, actions, and even intentions. It was as if they had created a shared rhythm, a language of trust and understanding that transcended words. They slept near one another, hunted and explored together, and gradually became inseparable. The war guardians had not returned, but the mechanic knew they were still watching. He prepared for eventual confrontation, reinforcing the workshop, hiding supplies, and planning escape routes. But he no longer felt fear. The predator was by his side, vigilant and powerful, and he had seen firsthand that courage, trust, and care could earn respect even from the most formidable authorities. One night, as the desert sky filled with stars, the mechanic sat outside, the predator curled beside him. He reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. He had come to the outpost seeking solitude and routine, but he had found something far greater: friendship, loyalty, and the kind of bond that could challenge even the strictest rules of the universe. The predator stirred, lifting its head and scanning the horizon. The mechanic followed its gaze and smiled. He realized that this creature, once enslaved, now stood as a guardian, not just for him, but for something larger, the principle that choice, trust, and courage mattered. It had chosen him freely, and in doing so, had transformed both their lives. They spent the night under the stars, quiet but connected. The desert was vast and full of unknowns, but the mechanic no longer felt alone. The predator had become more than a companion. It was a protector, a friend, and a constant reminder of what courage and compassion could accomplish. The next morning, they began to explore further, venturing toward distant mountains and hidden valleys. Each day brought challenges: harsh weather, treacherous terrain, and occasional encounters with other desert creatures, but the mechanic and the predator faced them together. He learned to rely on the predator's instincts, strength, and intelligence, while it learned to trust his guidance, protection, and care. In their travels, they discovered remnants of old outposts and abandoned technology, giving them clues about the wider universe. The mechanic repaired broken machines, powered dormant devices, and gradually built a sense of security and home in the harsh desert. The predator remained at his side, alert and watchful, ensuring that they faced no threat unprepared. Through all of this, their bond continued to grow. The mechanic spoke to the predator as he worked, shared stories of his life, and expressed thoughts and fears he had kept hidden for years. The predator responded with subtle gestures, nudges, purrs, or the gentle brush of its fur against his arm. These small acts became a language, one that conveyed trust, understanding, and loyalty without words. Eventually, they returned to the workshop, not as captives and captor, but as companions and partners. The predator moved freely, exploring every corner, climbing to high shelves, and observing the world with confidence. The mechanic repaired, cleaned, and organized, always aware that their lives were intertwined, bound by a trust forged in courage, care, and respect. The war guardians had not returned yet, but the mechanic was no longer worried. He knew that their bond, their choice, and their courage had created something that even the guardians had to recognize. They were no longer just a human and a predator. They were a team, a partnership built on understanding, loyalty, and mutual respect. As night fell, the mechanic sat outside once more, the predator resting at his side. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that they had survived the trials, earned the trust of a powerful creature, and established a bond that could not be broken. The desert stretched endlessly, silent and vast, but he was no longer alone. The future remained uncertain. There would be challenges, dangers, and moments that tested courage and patience. But for the first time, the mechanic felt ready to face them. With the predator by his side, he had strength, guidance, and a companion who had chosen him freely. Together, they would explore the universe, face its dangers, and create a life defined not by chains or fear, but by trust, loyalty, and shared adventure. And so, under the endless stars and the whispering wind of the desert, the mechanic and the predator began the next chapter of their journey, bound by courage, shaped by choice, and guided by the extraordinary trust between them. The world was wide, full of unknowns, but together they were unstoppable, ready to face anything that came their way, and forever changed by the bond that had begun with an act of compassion and a leap of courage.